The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, somewhere over the Syrian border where maps ended and nightmares began. Lieutenant Commander Kestrel Ghost Thorne adjusted her helmet's night vision display, watching the green-tinted landscape scroll beneath her F-35C Lightning II. The aircraft moved through the darkness like a whisper made of titanium and classified technology, its stealth coating drinking in radar waves and spitting back nothing but empty sky. "Ghost, this is Overwatch." The voice in her earpiece carried the weight of stars and stripes, of men in Washington who moved pieces on boards she'd never see. "We have a problem." She'd heard those words before. In Kandahar, when the convoy went silent. In the South China Sea, when the destroyer lost contact. Problems, in her experience, usually meant someone was about to die, and the brass needed someone expendable to fix it. "Copy Overwatch, send it." SEAL Team Bravo went dark 18 minutes ago. Last known position 3 clicks northeast of your current heading. They were tasked with extracting a high-value asset from a compound that, according to our intel, shouldn't exist. Ghost's fingers tightened on the stick. SEAL teams didn't just go dark. They were ghosts themselves, trained to slip in and out of impossible situations like smoke through a keyhole. If they'd vanished, something had gone very, very wrong. "What's the asset?" Silence stretched across the encrypted channel, the kind that meant someone was weighing classified briefings against operational necessity. Finally, a Russian scientist, nuclear physicist. He reached out through back channels 3 days ago, claimed he had information about a weapons program we thought was theoretical. The F-35's heads-up display painted targeting solutions across her visor as she banked northeast, the aircraft responding to her touch like an extension of her own nervous system. Below, the desert stretched endlessly, broken only by the occasional cluster of lights that marked villages caught between empires. "Overwatch, I need to know what I'm flying into. What kind of opposition are we talking about?" Another pause. When the voice returned, it carried a note she'd never heard from command before. Fear. "Ghost, that's the problem. We don't know. The compound doesn't show up on satellite imagery from yesterday, but thermal shows structures that weren't there 48 hours ago. Our drones are experiencing electromagnetic interference in a perfect circle around the site. And Ghost," the controller's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The last transmission from Team Bravo wasn't tactical chatter, it was screaming. Ghost felt ice form in her veins despite the cockpit's warmth. She'd flown over Fallujah when the insurgents had night vision. She'd provided close air support in places where the enemy had surface-to-air missiles and the will to use them. But this felt different. This felt impossible. "Copy Overwatch, proceeding to target area, Ghost out." The F-35 knifed through the darkness, carrying death and questions in equal measure toward whatever waited in the desert below. The compound materialized on Ghost's instruments like a fever dream rendered in infrared. What satellite imagery had missed, her aircraft's advanced sensors painted in stark detail. A cluster of buildings that seemed to bend light around their edges, as if reality itself was uncertain about their existence. The structures pulsed with a heat signature that defied physics, hot enough to register on thermal, but cold enough that her targeting computer kept losing lock. "Overwatch, Ghost, I'm eyes on target area. This doesn't make sense." "Explain." Ghost adjusted her sensor array, zooming in on the central building. "I'm seeing architecture that looks like it was grown rather than built. Heat signatures that shift between hot and cold every few seconds. And Overwatch," she paused, double-checking her readings. "I'm detecting aircraft on the ground, not helicopters, fixed wing, but they're not showing up on radar." The silence from command stretched long enough that she wondered if she'd lost communication. Then, "Ghost, we're seeing your feed. Stand by for new orders." She circled at 30,000 feet, well above any conventional anti-aircraft threat, but something made the hair on her neck stand up. The F-35's threat warning system remained silent, but her instincts, honed by two in Afghanistan and one in Syria, were screaming. Below, she could make out what looked like a landing strip, perfectly straight and unnaturally black against the desert floor. Parked along its length were shapes that registered as aircraft on thermal, but appeared as empty space on radar. They were sleek, angular, with a geometry that made her eyes water when she tried to focus on them. Ghost, new mission parameters. We need you to conduct a low-level reconnaissance pass. Get close enough for high-resolution imagery, then egress immediately. How close? 500 feet AGL. We need to see what we're dealing with. Ghost felt her mouth go dry. 500 feet above ground level would put her well within range of small arms fire, let alone any sophisticated air defense systems. It was the kind of altitude where skill mattered less than luck, and she'd never been particularly lucky. Copy Overwatch, beginning descent. She pushed the stick forward, feeling the familiar sensation of controlled falling as the F-35 dropped toward the mysterious compound. At 10,000 feet, her radar warning receiver chirped once, then went silent. At 5,000, the aircraft's systems began showing intermittent faults that cleared themselves before she could diagnose them. At 1,000 feet, she saw the bodies. They were arranged in a perfect circle around the central building, wearing the distinctive battle dress of Navy SEALs. From her altitude, she could see that their equipment was intact, their weapons still in their hands. They hadn't been killed by enemy fire. They'd simply fallen where they stood, as if something had reached inside their minds and flipped a switch. Overwatch, I've got eyes on Team Bravo, there. They're all down. No obvious wounds, no signs of struggle. It's like they just stopped. The radio crackled with interference that sounded almost like voices, speaking in languages she didn't recognize. When the static cleared, the voice from Overwatch carried a new urgency. Ghost, abort the recon pass. Climb immediately and egress the area. But she was already committed to the approach, the F-35 screaming toward the compound at just over the speed of sound. The moment Ghost passed through 500 feet, everything changed. The world around her F-35 shifted, colors bleeding into spectrums that didn't have names. The aircraft's instruments began displaying readings that violated the laws of physics: negative altitude, speeds that exceeded light, headings that pointed to compass directions that didn't exist. Through her canopy, she watched the compound below ripple like water, its buildings rearranging themselves in patterns that made her inner ear scream warnings about spatial impossibility. The dead SEALs stood up, turned their heads in perfect unison, and looked directly at her aircraft 30,000 feet above. Ghost, respond. Overwatch's voice cut through static that sounded like screaming. Your telemetry just went completely insane. What's your status? She tried to answer, but her throat had closed. The F-35's heads-up display was cycling through languages she'd never seen, symbols that hurt to look at, targeting solutions for weapons that didn't exist in any manual she'd studied. The aircraft was no longer responding to her inputs. It flew itself in a gentle spiral around the compound, as if something below was reeling her in like a fish on a line. Then she saw the scientist. He stood at the center of the compound, a figure in a white coat that remained perfectly clean despite the desert wind. His face was turned upward, watching her aircraft's spiral descent, and she could see that his eyes reflected starlight in a way that human eyes shouldn't. He raised one hand in what might have been a greeting or might have been a command. The F-35's engines died. Not shut down, not flamed out, simply ceased to exist. The aircraft continued flying, maintained altitude, responded to her desperate inputs, but the twin Pratt and Whitney turbofans that should have been pushing 35,000 pounds of thrust each were gone. In their place, a silence so complete it pressed against her eardrums like deep water. Ghost, you're showing engine failure across all parameters. Eject immediately. She reached for the ejection handle, her training taking over where rational thought failed. But her hand passed through the yellow and black striped grip as if it were made of light. The ejection seat, like the engines, had simply stopped existing in any meaningful way. The compound rushed up to meet her, its impossible architecture filling her vision. As the F-35 touched down on the black runway with the gentleness of a feather, Ghost realized that whatever was happening here operated by rules that predated human understanding of physics. The aircraft settled onto landing gear that shouldn't deploy at her airspeed, came to a complete stop without brakes or thrust reversers, and sat humming quietly on the tarmac as if it had always belonged there. Through the canopy, she watched the scientist approach. Behind him walked the 12 members of SEAL Team Bravo, their movements perfectly synchronized, their eyes reflecting that same impossible starlight. Her radio crackled one final time. "Ghost, report status. Ghost, respond, Ghost." Then silence, complete and total, as if sound itself had been forbidden in this place between realities. The canopy of the F-35 opened without her touching any controls, revealing air that tasted of copper and electricity. Ghost unstrapped herself from the ejection seat, her hands moving independently of conscious thought, and climbed down from the aircraft. Her boots hit the black surface of the runway, which felt solid beneath her feet but looked like liquid obsidian that reflected stars from a sky that wasn't quite the same color as the one she'd been flying through moments before. The scientist approached with measured steps, his white coat somehow remaining immaculate despite the wind that should have been stirring up sand and dust. Up close, she could see that his face was human enough, sharp cheekbones, graying hair, the kind of intellectual intensity she'd seen in briefing rooms back at Langley. But his eyes held depths that belonged to ocean trenches, and when he smiled, she could see that his teeth cast no shadows. "Lieutenant Commander Thorne," he said, and his voice carried accents from languages that predated recorded history. "You may call me Dr. Kozlov. Welcome to the future." The SEAL team arranged themselves in a semicircle behind him, their movements still unnaturally synchronized. She could see their faces now, and while their expressions were calm, there was something missing from their eyes, some essential humanity that had been carefully excised. "What did you do to them?" Ghost asked, surprised that her voice worked normally in this place where physics had apparently taken a sabbatical. "I offered them transcendence," Kozlov replied. "The same gift I'm prepared to offer you. Your aircraft, as you may have noticed, has been upgraded. Its stealth capabilities now extend beyond mere radar invisibility. It can move between the spaces in reality, slip through dimensions that your military hasn't discovered yet." Ghost looked back at her F-35, which sat on the impossible runway like a predator at rest. The aircraft looked identical to when she'd climbed out, but something fundamental had changed. The air around it seemed thinner, as if the plane occupied slightly less space than it should. "The SEALs came here to extract you," she said, trying to maintain some connection to the mission parameters she'd been given. "Instead, you converted them into what? Drones." "Enhanced soldiers," Kozlov corrected gently. "They retain their skills, their training, their tactical knowledge. They've simply been freed from the limitations of individual will, the chaos of personal emotion. They are perfect now, unified in purpose." One of the SEALs stepped forward, his name tape-read Morrison, and spoke in a voice that carried harmonics no human throat should produce. "The transition is painless, Commander. We are still ourselves, but more. We serve a cause greater than nations, beyond the petty conflicts that divide your species." Ghost's hand moved instinctively toward her sidearm, then stopped when she realized the holster was empty. She hadn't even noticed drawing the weapon, but there it was in Morrison's hand, offered grip first with the casual efficiency of someone returning borrowed property. "There is no violence here," Kozlov said. "Violence is a function of separate interests competing survival imperatives. We have moved beyond such inefficiencies." The compound around them continued to shift and breathe, its buildings rearranging themselves in patterns that suggested vast intelligence working through problems she couldn't comprehend. In the distance, she could see more aircraft, not just the strange, angular shapes she'd spotted from altitude, but familiar silhouettes. An F-22 Raptor with Chinese markings, a Russian Su-57 that should have been painted in standard camouflage, but instead seemed to absorb light, a European Typhoon that moved independently across the runway despite having no visible pilot. "How long has this been going on?" Ghost asked. "Time operates differently here," Kozlov replied. "Your linear chronology suggests 3 months since I made first contact with your intelligence services. From my perspective, I have been building this facility for several decades. Reality, Commander Thorne, is far more flexible than your physicists suspect." The radio in her flight suit crackled to life, carrying voices from what felt like a different universe. Any station, this is Overwatch. We have lost contact with Ghost and are showing multiple aircraft converging on her last known position. Request immediate assistance from any allied forces in the region." Kozlov tilted his head, listening to the transmission with the attention of a musician hearing a particularly complex symphony. "Your commanders are sending more pilots. They will arrive within the hour, a mixed squadron of your best aircraft, flown by your most experienced aviators. They come to rescue you, unaware that rescue and transformation are often indistinguishable." Ghost felt cold spread through her chest as she understood the implications. Whatever had happened to the SEAL team, whatever was happening to her, was just the beginning. The strange compound, the impossible aircraft, the selective editing of physical laws. It was all bait in a trap designed to catch the very best her military had to offer. "You're building an air force," she realized, "not to conquer territory or destroy targets, to recruit." Kozlov's smile widened, and for just a moment, she could see the vast intelligence behind his human facade, cold and patient and utterly alien in its priorities. "Now you begin to understand." The sound of approaching aircraft reached them across the desert, the distinctive thunder of military jets pushed to maximum throttle, their pilots racing toward what they believed was a rescue mission. Ghost closed her eyes and tried to count the different engine signatures. At least 6 aircraft, maybe 8. Enough firepower to level a small city, flown by pilots who represented the cream of multiple air forces. All of them flying straight into the same trap that had claimed her. "The compound's electromagnetic signature will disrupt their communications once they pass through the outer perimeter," Kozlov explained with the casual tone of a professor discussing a routine experiment. "Their instruments will begin showing impossible readings. Some will attempt to abort and return to base. Others will press forward, driven by training and loyalty to their missing comrade." Through her flight suit's radio, Ghost could hear the chatter as the rescue squadron approached. "Viper 2-1, this is Viper lead. I'm showing massive M interference ahead. Switching to backup navigation." "Copy lead. Viper 2-2 is experiencing similar issues. My radar's painting ghosts all over the scope." "Stay tight, gentlemen. Ghost is down there somewhere and we're not leaving without her." The voice belonged to Colonel Marcus "Iceman" Valdez, her former squadron commander and the closest thing to a father figure she'd known since joining the Air Force. She'd flown wing for him over Syria, watched him thread an F-15E through surface-to-air missile fire to extract a downed pilot. If anyone could penetrate this impossible place and bring her home, it was Iceman. Which made what was about to happen infinitely worse. "You could warn them off," Kozlov suggested, as if reading her thoughts. "Your radio still functions. A simple transmission explaining the situation might convince some of them to abort their approach. And the others would undoubtedly ignore the warning and press their attack. Your military culture values courage over caution, sacrifice over survival. These traits make your species excellent soldiers but poor prospects for evolution." The first aircraft appeared on the horizon, An F-15E Strike Eagle flying low and fast, its twin engines leaving contrails in the dry desert air. Even from several miles away, Ghost could see that something was wrong with its flight profile. The aircraft was making minute course corrections too quickly, as if the pilot was fighting his own instruments for control. "Viper lead, this is Ghost." She keyed her radio, hopping against hope that some part of the normal world still functioned out here. "Do not approach the compound. Repeat, do not approach. The situation is not what it appears to be." Static answered her, filled with voices speaking in that same unknown language she'd heard earlier. When Iceman's voice finally broke through, it carried the distortion of someone shouting through water. "Ghost, thank God. What's your status? We're showing your aircraft on the ground, but your beacon went dark 20 minutes ago." "Iceman, listen to me carefully. This place isn't natural. It's a trap designed to capture military aircraft and their pilots. You need to abort and return to base immediately." The F-15E was close enough now that she could see its weapons loadout. AIM-120 AMRAAMs on the wing pylons, a pair of GBU-31 Joint Direct Attack munitions on the centerline. Enough firepower to turn the compound into a crater, assuming conventional explosives could affect whatever this place really was. "Negative, Ghost. We're not leaving without you. Stand by for immediate extraction." She watched helplessly as the Strike Eagle crossed some invisible threshold, its flight path immediately becoming erratic as the compound's influence took hold. The aircraft began a gentle spiral, following the same pattern her F-35 had traced minutes earlier, despite the pilot's obvious attempts to break free and climb to safety. Behind Iceman, she could see the rest of the squadron: two more F-15Es, a pair of F-16C Fighting Falcons, and bringing up the rear, the angular silhouette of an F-22 Raptor. 6 of the Air Force's most advanced fighters, flown by pilots with thousands of hours of combined experience, all descending into the same impossible trap that had claimed her. Dr. Kozlov watched the approaching aircraft with the satisfied expression of a collector adding rare specimens to his display. "You're Colonel Valdez," he said. 3,000 flight hours, 2 distinguished flying crosses, veteran of 4 combat deployments. He will make an excellent addition to our growing fleet." "What do you want?" Ghost demanded. "What's the point of collecting military pilots and their aircraft?" "Your species stands at a crossroads, Commander Thorne. The next century will determine whether humanity expands beyond this single world or destroys itself in increasingly sophisticated wars. The choice, unfortunately, will not be made by your philosophers or your scientists. It will be decided by your warriors." The first F-15E touched down on the black runway with the same impossible gentleness her F-35 had experienced, its engines cutting out the moment the landing gear made contact. Through the cockpit canopy, she could see Iceman struggling with his ejection seat, his face a mask of professional frustration as he discovered what she already knew: that certain technologies simply cease to function in this place between realities. "We are offering your best pilots a choice," Kozlov continued as the remaining aircraft began their own involuntary landings. "Join us willingly and retain your individuality, your memories, your essential self. Resist and become part of our collective consciousness, your skills preserved but your personality simplified." The canopies of the landed aircraft opened in perfect synchronization, revealing pilots whose expressions ranged from bewilderment to anger, to a growing understanding that they had stumbled into something far beyond their training or experience. Ghost recognized most of them: Rodriguez from the 334th Fighter Squadron, Nakamura, who'd flown close air support over Iraq, Davies, who'd shot down 2 Syrian MiGs during the 2019 border incident. All of them looking to her for answers she didn't have, for leadership in a situation where all the rules had been rewritten by forces they couldn't comprehend. Colonel Valdez was the first to speak as he climbed down from his Strike Eagle, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd commanded squadrons in combat. "Ghost, report. What's our tactical situation?" She gestured toward the SEAL team, still arranged in their unnaturally precise formation, their eyes reflecting starlight that came from no source she could identify. Hostile forces have some kind of technology that affects human consciousness. The ground team was compromised shortly after arrival. I believe the intent is to do the same to us. Iceman's eyes moved from the SEALs to Kozlov, taking in the scientist's immaculate white coat and too bright smile. His hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm, then stopped when he realized the holster was empty. "Where are our weapons?" "Your tools of violence have been temporarily set aside," Kozlov explained with the patience of someone addressing children. "They serve no purpose here. We are not your enemies, Colonel. We are your evolution." "Evolution doesn't usually require kidnapping," Lieutenant Davies said, his Irish accent thick with anger. "What do you want from us?" "To give you the stars." Kozlov gestured toward the sky, where the familiar constellations had been subtly rearranged into patterns that suggested vast distances and impossible journeys. "Your species has reached the limits of what it can accomplish while trapped by individual consciousness, separate national interests, the chaos of competing survival instincts. We offer unity, purpose, the ability to move between worlds as easily as you currently move between countries." Captain Rodriguez, the most junior pilot in the group, stepped forward with the kind of aggressive curiosity that had probably gotten him in trouble throughout his career. "And if we refuse?" One of the SEALs, Thompson, according to his name tape, turned toward Rodriguez with movements that were too fluid, too coordinated with his 11 teammates. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that made the air itself seem to vibrate. "Refusal is a temporary condition, Captain. Individual will is a luxury this universe can no longer afford." Ghost watched her fellow pilots process the implications, saw the moment when professional training began competing with primal survival instincts. These were people who'd volunteered to strap themselves into machines designed to travel at twice the speed of sound, who'd flown combat missions over hostile territory where death could arrive in the form of a radar lock or a surface-to-air missile. They weren't easily intimidated. But they were also intelligent enough to recognize when they were completely out of their depth. "Iceman," she said quietly, "we need to find a way to communicate with base. Let them know what's happening here before more squadrons are dispatched." Valdez nodded almost imperceptibly, his eyes already cataloging potential escape routes and tactical advantages in an environment where traditional military doctrine had become meaningless. "Copy that, Ghost. Any ideas on how we accomplish that when our radios are apparently compromised and our aircraft seem to be inoperative?" Before she could answer, the compound around them began to shift again, its buildings flowing like liquid architecture. New structures emerged from the desert floor, hangars large enough to accommodate aircraft she'd never seen before, control towers that spiraled toward the impossible sky in geometric patterns that hurt to follow with the naked eye. And from the distance, carried on wind that tasted of copper and ozone, came the sound of more engines approaching. "Ah," Kozlov said, his smile widening. "The next group arrives ahead of schedule. I believe your commanders are becoming concerned about the number of aircraft they've lost contact with." Ghost felt despair settle in her chest like lead. However many planes were approaching, however many skilled pilots were about to be added to this collection, each arrival only made the situation worse. At some point, someone at command was going to realize that sending more rescue missions was feeding whatever intelligence lurked behind Kozlov's human facade. But by then, it might be too late to matter. The approaching aircraft, she could count at least 8 distinct engine signatures now, were flying in loose formation, their pilots undoubtedly receiving the same garbled radio transmissions and impossible instrument readings that had drawn her and Iceman's squadron into this trap. Soon, there would be enough captured aircraft and pilots to constitute a small air force, and Ghost was beginning to understand that conquest might not be the goal. It might only be the beginning. Ghost watched 12 more aircraft settle onto the impossible runway with the same unnatural grace that had claimed her F-35 and Iceman Strike Eagles. The new arrivals were a mixed bag, Air Force F-16s flying alongside Navy FA-18 Super Hornets, with a pair of Marine Corps AV-8B Harriers bringing up the rear. Nearly $40 million worth of military hardware, flown by some of the most experienced aviators in 3 different services. All of it now part of Dr. Kozlov's growing collection. As the canopies opened and the pilots climbed down from their aircraft, Ghost recognized the expression she'd seen on her own face in the reflection of her cockpit glass 20 minutes earlier. Confusion giving way to growing dread as they realized their radios were silent, their ejection seats non-functional, their weapons mysteriously absent. Commander Sarah Chen, leader of the Navy squadron, was the first to take charge of the situation. Ghost knew Chen by reputation, a former Top Gun instructor who'd flown combat missions over the Persian Gulf and the South China Sea. Her voice carried the kind of authority that came from leading pilots into situations where mistakes were measured in lives rather than points. All personnel sound off, status report. The pilots responded with a mixture of call signs and real names, their training asserting itself despite the circumstances. Ghost listened to the roster and felt her heart sink further. These weren't random aviators pulled from routine patrols. Every pilot present was combat experienced, carrying decorations and commendations that represented the cream of American military aviation. Someone at the Pentagon was sending their best people directly into this trap. "Commander Chen," Ghost called out, "I'm Lieutenant Commander Thorne, Air Force. I've been here approximately 45 minutes. The situation is complicated." Chen's eyes moved from Ghost to the SEAL team, still maintaining their unnaturally perfect formation, then to Kozlov, who watched the new arrivals with the satisfied expression of a curator adding pieces to a prized collection. "Explain complicated, Commander." Before Ghost could answer, one of the Marine Harrier pilots, Captain James Mitchell, according to his name tape, stepped forward with the kind of aggressive posture that suggested he wasn't planning to accept the current situation passively. "Sir, with respect, I don't give a damn how complicated it is. I need to get back to my squadron. My wingman's flying solo over hostile territory while I'm down here playing games with some Russian scientist in a lab coat." Dr. Kozlov turned his attention to Mitchell with the kind of focus a hawk might give a particularly interesting mouse. "Captain Mitchell, 3 tour in Afghanistan, 2 in Syria. Silver Star, Distinguished Flying Cross, Purple Heart. You've seen more combat than most generals will experience in their entire careers." "How do you know that?" Mitchell's hand moved instinctively toward where his sidearm should have been, finding empty air. "I know all of you," Kozlov replied, gesturing to encompass the growing crowd of pilots. "Your service records, your psychological profiles, your tactical preferences. You were not selected randomly for this mission. You were chosen specifically because you represent the pinnacle of human military aviation." Commander Chen stepped between Mitchell and Kozlov, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that came from years of managing aggressive personalities in high-stress situations. "Selected by whom, and for what purpose?" "By those who recognize that your species stands at a critical juncture," Kozlov explained. "The next 50 years will determine whether humanity expands beyond this single world or destroys itself in increasingly sophisticated conflicts. The decision will not be made by your politicians or your scientists. It will be decided by people like you, those who understand both the technology of warfare and the psychology of command." Ghost watched the assembled pilots process this information, saw the moment when professional skepticism began competing with the evidence of their own senses. These were people trained to assess threats and respond accordingly, but the threat assessment protocols didn't include provisions for physics-defying compounds in the middle of the Syrian desert. "You're talking about some kind of recruitment operation," Chen said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "What exactly are you recruiting us for?" Instead of answering directly, Kozlov gestured toward the sky, where the familiar star patterns had been subtly rearranged into configurations that suggested vast distances and impossible journeys. "Your government spent hundreds of billions of dollars developing weapons designed to kill other humans. Imagine if that same technology, that same tactical brilliance, were directed toward expansion rather than destruction." "Expansion into what?" Lieutenant Davies asked, his Irish accent thick with suspicion. "Other worlds, other dimensions, realities where the laws of physics are more flexible than they appear to be here." The compound around them continued to shift and breathe, its buildings flowing like liquid architecture guided by intelligence beyond human comprehension. New structures emerged from the desert floor, launch platforms that spiraled upward in geometric patterns that made ghosts in her ear scream warnings about impossible angles. Control rooms whose windows showed views of skis that belonged to different worlds entirely. "This is insane," Captain Rodriguez muttered, but his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. They were all seeing the same impossible things, experiencing the same selective editing of physical laws that governed their reality. "Insanity," Kozlov said gently, "is believing that a species capable of interstellar travel would limit itself to a single world simply because that's where it evolved. You have the skills, the technology, and the tactical knowledge necessary to guide humanity's expansion into the universe. All that's required is a broader perspective." One of the SEALs, Morrison, stepped forward with that unnaturally fluid movement Ghost had noticed earlier. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that seemed to come from somewhere other than his throat. "The transition is not painful. We retain our memories, our skills, our tactical knowledge. We have simply been freed from the limitations of individual consciousness, the chaos of competing personal agendas." Captain Mitchell turned to face Morrison, his expression a mixture of anger and growing understanding. "What did they do to you, Marine?" "They offered us evolution," Morrison replied. "The same choice they're offering you. Join willingly and retain your individuality, your essential self. Resist and become part of our collective consciousness, your skills preserved but your personality simplified." The implications hung in the air like smoke from a crashed aircraft. Ghost watched her fellow pilots absorb the reality of their situation, that this wasn't a standard hostage scenario or even a conventional military operation. They were being offered a choice between voluntary transformation or involuntary assimilation. And somewhere in the distance, carried on wind that shouldn't exist in this desert climate, came the sound of more engines approaching. "How many?" Commander Chen asked, her voice tight with the kind of professional concern that came from realizing the full scope of a developing disaster. Kozlov tilted his head, listening to frequencies beyond human perception. 18 aircraft this time. Your superiors are becoming quite concerned about the number of pilots they've lost contact with. They're sending everything they have available, Air Force, Navy, Marines, even a few Allied aircraft from the multinational task force." Ghost closed her eyes and tried to calculate the mathematics of catastrophe. If the pattern continued, if every rescue mission only fed more pilots and aircraft into this impossible trap, within hours Dr. Kozlov would have enough military assets to constitute a significant threat to conventional forces. But as she looked around at the ever-expanding compound, at the aircraft that sat on runways that shouldn't exist, at the buildings that rearranged themselves according to alien logic, she began to suspect that conventional military threats were not the point. Whatever Kozlov was building, whatever intelligence lurked behind his human facade, it operated on a scale that made terrestrial conflicts seem as insignificant as playground disputes. The sound of approaching engines grew louder, and Ghost found herself silently counting the distinct signatures. 18 aircraft, just as Kozlov had predicted. 18 more pilots about to discover that their rescue mission had become something else entirely. And behind them, she knew, would come more. Because that's what military commanders did when their people went missing. They sent more people to find them. It was a tactical doctrine that had served well in conventional conflicts. Here, it was exactly what the enemy wanted. The 18 aircraft that landed in the next wave brought the total to nearly 30 of the most advanced military aircraft in the world, flown by pilots whose combined experience represented decades of training and millions of dollars in investment. Ghost watched them climb down from their cockpits with expressions ranging from professional confusion to barely contained rage, all of them trying to process a situation that fell outside every contingency they'd been trained for. Among the new arrivals, she recognized faces from throughout the military aviation community. Major Patricia "Venom" Santos, who'd flown F-22 Raptors in the Pacific Theater. Captain David "Razor" Kim, a Navy pilot whose F-A-18 had been modified for electronic warfare. Lieutenant Colonel Michael "Hawk" Peterson, whose A-10 Warthog carried battle damage from 3 different conflict zones. All of them looking to the growing crowd of earlier arrivals for answers that nobody possessed. Dr. Kozlov surveyed the assembled pilots with the satisfaction of someone whose careful planning had exceeded expectations. The compound around them continued to expand, new runways and hangars emerging from the desert floor to accommodate the growing fleet. In the distance, Ghost could see aircraft that defied easy categorization, sleek shapes that seemed to absorb light, angular fighters whose geometry hurt to look at directly, transport craft large enough to carry entire squadrons. "Ladies and gentlemen," Kozlov addressed the crowd, his voice somehow reaching every pilot despite the desert wind and the continued sounds of impossible construction. "You represent the finest military aviators your species has produced. Together, your skills encompass air-to-air combat, ground attack, electronic warfare, strategic reconnaissance, and close air support. You are quite literally irreplaceable." Major Santos stepped forward, her voice carrying the kind of skeptical authority that came from years of briefing rooms and intelligence assessments. "Irreplaceable for what? What exactly do you need us for?" Instead of answering directly, Kozlov gestured toward one of the strange aircraft Ghost had noticed earlier, a craft whose hull seemed to shift between different reflective states, sometimes showing the desert around them, sometimes displaying views of alien landscapes under.